Okay, tonight's class is on Federalist Paper 51. Federalist Paper 10 and Federalist Paper 51 are the two most commonly cited Federalist papers. And so we'll get into 51 tonight. It covers the structure of the government, must furnish the proper checks and balance between the different departments. Now, remember, the whole thing to government is the right amount, the right balance in government. And that's what the Constitution was to bring us, was the right balance in government. The Articles of Confederation couldn't do it. And that's why the delegation, the delegates that came to Philadelphia got rid of the Articles of Confederation for the Constitution. And so even in government, too much government is tyranny, too little government is anarchy. So even between the departments, the balance between them had to be the right amount. So for each department, each branch of the government was given just the amount of power that they would need to defend themselves against the amount. They were given the right amount of defense for the amount of offense that would be used against them from any of the other departments. And so this was one of the fears by the Anti-Federalists. And so Hamilton and Madison wrote this together, and they answered the Anti-Federalists on the balance in the power, the separation of the different departments, and the balance that they would have. So this is Federalist Paper 51. It was published on the 8th of February, 1788. It was written by Hamilton and Madison for the New York Packet. And as they all start out, to the people of the state of New York. To what expedient then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? The only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in the proper places. What he's talking about here is these natural law checks and balances, right? Natural law. When we talk about natural law, who is the author of natural law? Who is the judge of natural law? God. The reason why they wanted to do this is because they know that the law left in the hands of man will become, at some point in time, tyrannical, if left to man. So thereby, what they're talking about is these checks and balances that need to be in there to keep these departments in their proper place must be of natural law. There must be natural law checks and balances put in there. So not just checks and balances within the law itself, but natural law checks and balances. Without presuming to undertake a full development of this important idea, I will hazard a few general observations which may perhaps place it in a clear light and enable us to form a more correct judgment of the principles and the structure of the government planned by the convention. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Okay? So each department is separate. Each branch is a separate branch of government, right? So they're supposed to have agency within their own branch. And this is where we start talking about executive orders, right? I listened to a speech the other day in the biblical citizenship, and trust me, I agree with 99.9% of what they talk about. But the commentator or the instructor at the time said, well, executive orders are good by the president to enforce laws that the legislature's already, or that the Congress has already passed, but that they can't be used to create law, and they can't be used to not enforce laws that Congress has enacted. Well, that's holy bunk by the Federalist Papers. That's not true at all. And reading here, an executive order is good, but only for the executive branch. And if it's made by the president, only the executive branch, the executives in the federal sphere, right? So how does an executive order by the president make me have to wear a mask in Indiana? Doesn't. I'm not in an executive branch of government, federal. So thereby the president's executive order means absolutely nothing to me. Now, the governor, is that an executive branch government? So they can issue executive orders as well, can't they? Okay, but when they issue an executive order, who does that executive order fall on? Does it fall on the people of the state of Indiana? Or does it fall on the executives within the state sphere? That's who it falls on. That's it. Doesn't fall on the legislative of the state. Doesn't fall on the judicial of the state. Doesn't fall on the citizens of the state. An executive order is just that, to the executives of that branch, that sphere of control. Does that make sense? Now, case precedent, have we allowed it in the past to cover other people or to create law? Yep. Yeah. And how has that been done? By the ignorance of the people. The superior power, or we the people are the government. We are the superior authority in America. The Constitution is the supreme law in America, but we are the supreme power in America. So if I can tell people it's illegal to drive in your bare feet, and so people don't, it's just as much a law as if the legislature signed it, isn't it? So do you see how being ignorant can give more power to positions within the government than what that government was supposed, than what that branch was supposed to have? Yep. Sure is. I finished that one, right?
No. Where the principal rigorously?
Where are we at?
In the middle?
Right there. Where this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistrates should be drawn from the same fountain of authority. What is that fountain of authority? We the people, right? The people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. Perhaps such a plan of constructing the several departments would be less difficult in practice than it may be in contemplation appear. So what he's saying is, this, if you remember 10, he said factions are the enemy of all popular government, right? He said democracies have always been tumultuous in their life as they have been violent in their deaths. Democracies are horrible forms of government, and thereby that's why they decided on a republic, right? Okay, so he said we can't deal with faction by its causes, we have to deal with faction by its effects. And in a democracy, when everybody is picked by a popular vote, it breeds faction. It creates faction, and that's why democracies have always been incompatible with the ownership of property or personal liberty. This is why they didn't want a democracy. So what he's talking about is when we vote from the supreme authority, which is we the people, for these different branches, we had to do it by taking the authority from the supreme authority, which is the people, but doing it by different modes so that we didn't breed faction as it is done in a democracy. So do you understand why the 17th Amendment was a horrible, horrible amendment? Because it took one of the different modes of picking the senators out. It was a natural law check and balance that now the senators are picked by a popular vote of the people and no longer by the state legislature, right? So do you understand why it doesn't work? You understand why the senators are a horrible group of a governing body anymore? They're detestable because they're not doing what they were intended to do by the Constitution. We destroyed that with the 17th Amendment. This is when I tell people the 17th Amendment put us halfway into a direct democracy, which is exactly where Woodrow Wilson wanted us to go. Because obviously he didn't believe what Madison talked about in Federalist 10. And here in 51, he's reaffirming what he talked about in 10. Democracies are horrible. We can't have that. Democracies breed faction. Faction destroys government. And if we pick every position in every branch by a popular vote, we breed faction. But we still, because we're a republic, we still have to go to the supreme authority, which is we the people. So how do we do it without breeding faction? By picking those different branches by different modes, but still either directly or indirectly from the people. Does that make sense? Okay. And he's saying that it seems pretty difficult by contemplation, but in practice, it'll be much easier than what people are thinking. Some difficulties, however, and some additional expense would attend to the execution of it. Some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle. First, because particular qualifications being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be to select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. Now, we just saw this in the Senate confirmation hearings for federal judges, in which you had one person that was put up to be a federal judge that could not tell you what was in the second or third article of the Constitution. You had one couldn't even tell him what the fifth article was about in the Constitution. And these are people that want to be federal judges. You think federal judges deal with state law or federal law? Federal. Okay, is the Constitution state or federal? The Constitution they designed was a federal Constitution, wasn't it? Shouldn't that scare you? Shouldn't that scare you? That these people that want to be your federal judges couldn't even answer what one of the articles of the Constitution was? 7 articles of the Constitution is pretty simple. First article sets up the legislative branch. Second article sets up the executive branch. Third article sets up the judiciary. Fourth article is the state's rights and responsibilities. Fifth is how to change the Constitution, right? The sixth is the supremacy clause and the oath of office. And the seventh is the ratification of the Constitution. Pretty simple. How is it that somebody like me that doesn't even have postnomials knows that, and somebody that wants to be your federal court judge couldn't even answer one of those simple 5th grade questions? We've come a long way, baby. Just the wrong way. So what he's talking about is the judiciary. These people should be law professionals. They should understand the theory of the law, going all the way back to 1040, back to the common law. Secondly, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. So, the Congress, the legislative branch, which is the largest and most powerful branch, should be the most responsive to the people, so they only had 2-year terms, right? Then you had the executive branch. Now, the legislative branch has 2 powers. What are the 2 powers that the legislative branch has? The power of the purse and the power of impeachment. The executive, Article 2, sets up the executive branch of government. It had less power, and to compensate for that, they gave them 4-year terms. What's the power that the executive has? Power of the sword. Then they set up the judiciary with the 3rd article of the Constitution. They were supposed to have lifetime appointments during times of good behavior. Why? Right here's one of the reasons. Must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. They didn't want them to become political. They didn't want them to have some sense of that they had to pay back somebody, that they didn't want to have them to have some sense of what's the word? What's that? Allegiance. They didn't want them to have an allegiance to the authority that set them. They want them to have the allegiance to the Constitution. Thereby, Article 6, Section 1, Clause 3, the judges that have to take the oath of office, they take an oath to uphold, support, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Nowhere in there does it say that they are supposed to interpret it, because it's already been interpreted in 85 Federalist Papers. Now, if a Supreme Court justice does not follow their oath, if they violate their oath, is that good behavior? No, it's not, and they should be impeached for that. But the problem is the 17th Amendment. Right? The Senate. That's your problem. This is why we've had Supreme Court justices that have made some outlandish case precedent law on the Constitution and misread the Commerce Clause and decided that somewhere in the Constitution it was written that women have the right to kill babies. It's not there. And those people should have been impeached for not supporting their oath of office, for not being in good behavior. But if you remember back that 700 years of history, what did William the Conqueror do as soon as he took England in 1066, Battle of Hastings? What did he do? First thing he did is he started pulling in judges from Normandy and putting them in place so that they would have an allegiance to the king and not to the law. So where do you think our founders got that idea from? From history. They saw that it's not good. They want the president to be able to appoint these people, but it has to be through advice and consent of the Senate. And the Senate was supposed to be picked by the legislature of each state, where they could be shamed when they do stupid things, like put a federal court judge in that can't answer a simple question of what the 5th article of the Constitution is about. Do you see how broken we are? See, through the 20th century, we've been taking out these natural law checks and balances that were in the Constitution. It is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments annexed to their offices. Were the executive magistrate or the judges not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. So he's talking about they understand the natural nature of man, right? And they also understand that because the legislative is the largest body of government, that usually throughout history, that's where all the power was usurped to. It would usually gravitate there, right? There's another natural law. In space, the larger the mass of a body, the more gravity it has to pull things towards it, right? And they knew the same thing existed with the legislature. Because it's the largest and most powerful branch of government, they were worried that it would, through gravity, through usurpation, would take the powers of the other two branches. They were worried about that. That's why they set them as separate branches of government with very little connection. The provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. There's your balance. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So the ambition of the man needs to be pitted against the ambition of the man. What did we learn from Franklin's speech? There's two things that rule the hearts of man: avarice and ambition. The love of money and the love of power. Right? This is a self-evident truth. This is a natural law. And so they looked at that natural nature of man and said, how do we pit those things against one another to keep each department separate and to keep the other departments from usurping that power? See, Madison expected that people would jealously guard the power that they had and not usurp it to someone else. What happened during 2020 when we had these governors acting like imperialist emperors, making executive orders upon the people? How many of your legislatures stood up and said, "Are you nuts? That's our power to make law. We didn't make a law. You set yourself down and stay in your lane"? How many legislatures did that? None of them. None of them. Is that a usurpation of the power of your legislature for the governor to enact some sort of a law over the people? Absolutely it is. So where was their avarice? Where was it? See, this is the problem. Through the 20th century, as we started taking these natural law checks and balances that we didn't think that there was a problem with. Oh yeah, 17th Amendment sounds like a great idea. Let's vote for that steaming pile of crap. Why? Out of ignorance. It says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. It was our lack of knowledge that caused us to vote for stuff like that. And why? Because this was not being taught. Why wasn't it being taught? Well, because it was the John Dewey model of public school, set up on the Communist Manifesto, that was going to indoctrinate your children. And we've all been indoctrinated by it. How many people here remember hearing this in high school? You're a rarity. You're a rarity. When I was in high school, my civics class that I had to have to graduate, you could miss every question and answer the bonus question and pass the class to graduate. The bonus question was, who shot JR? Hand to God. I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious. Where was the school board? They didn't care. They didn't care. Everybody was too busy. Too busy with their white picket fence and their 2.3 kids, their dog and their cat. Couldn't go to a school board meeting, couldn't go to a township meeting, couldn't go to a county board meeting. And the whole time, the Communist Manifesto was indoctrinating the children to not know. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. You see these little checks and balances that we didn't think were that much. Why? Because we didn't have the knowledge. We're stripped from the Constitution and see where it's going now. Do you see the problems? It's pretty simple. By the way, that's one of the key features in 51. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The ambition of the man should counteract the ambition of the man. That is a key phrase, a key point within 51. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. See, they understood the natural nature of man. They didn't judge it good or bad. They just said, this is how man acts. And he has for 6,000 years. And so we need to do certain things because man's not going to change. This is why our Constitution must remain Newtonian and not Darwinian, as the progressives want it to be. But what is government itself? But the greatest of all reflections on human nature. Again, they understood the natural nature of man. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Now, these little natural law checks and balances, is he talking as those being external controls on government or internal controls? Internal. That's what this whole paper is about. The external controls on government are we, the supreme authority, we the people. But there needs to be internal checks, internal natural law checks, so that we wouldn't experience 2020 through 2023. Do you see why we're where we're at? These men were absolute genius, and they were genius because this thing was written with divine intervention. You can't convince me otherwise. The hand of God is all over it. If angels, this is another key point in this Federalist 51. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And isn't that true? Men were angels. Men didn't have the natural nature that we have. There would be no need for government. Because what's the reason for government? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, driving their just power from the consent of the governed. So, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government because we would already protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But because that isn't true, we need government. But, and it says right here, what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? So if that's the case, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But we know, I don't think you would find an angel anywhere in D.C. Anywhere. I think you're going to find more demonic spirit than angelic spirit in Washington, D.C. So we know that to be true. In framing a government which is to be administered by men, over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Think about that. Government does have authority over us, right? There is authority that we allow them to have.